The envelope trembled in Susan Davidson's hands as she stared at the numbers for the 20th time. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Was this really happening? $10 million. The sum was so enormous it didn't feel real. Susan had never considered herself lucky. Quite the opposite, in fact. At 37 years old, her generosity had often left her checking account drained and her trust betrayed. Yet here she was, holding a winning lottery ticket worth $10 million. And the irony wasn't lost on her. She hadn't even wanted to join the office pool. "Come on, Susan, it's just $20, Jennifer Sanders had insisted 3 weeks ago, leaning against Susan's desk with that persuasive smile of hers. "Everyone in the department is joining. Don't you want to be part of our future yacht club?" Susan had laughed and handed over the money, mostly to stop Jennifer from hovering over her desk. "Fine, but when we don't win, which we won't, you're buying me lunch." Now, sitting alone in her modest apartment, Susan couldn't believe the outcome. The morning news had announced the winning numbers, and when Jennifer called screaming about their shared victory, Susan had nearly dropped her coffee mug. The bank's employee pool had won the jackpot. $10 million, split between 5 people, $2 million each. More money than Susan had ever imagined having. She placed the envelope containing the ticket confirmation on her coffee table and walked to the window. The city sprawled before her, unchanged, while her entire life had just transformed. $2 million. She could pay off her student loans, buy a house, travel the world. All those dreams she'd pushed aside for someday. Someday had arrived in a random sequence of numbers. But, as the initial shock began to fade, a more complicated emotion took its place. Susan thought about her family. Her father, Harold, who had borrowed $3,000 last Christmas for emergency dental work, but somehow managed to buy a new fishing boat in January. Her brother, Richard, who had a talent for calling with teary stories about overdue rent just after buying the latest gaming system. The pattern had repeated for years, and Susan, ever the responsible one, ever the soft touch, had opened her wallet, time and again. "You know I'm good for it, Susie," Richard would say, using the childhood nickname she hated. "I'll pay you back as soon as my commission comes through." The commission never came through. The money never returned. And Susan found herself working overtime to rebuild her savings, too embarrassed to admit she was struggling because she couldn't say no to family. Susan made herself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling her kitchen as she continued to process her new reality. The cup warmed her hands as she contemplated what to do next. The lottery commission had informed them that they could remain anonymous if they wished. A small mercy in a world where sudden wealth often attracted unwanted attention. None of her co-workers planned to announce their winnings publicly. They would all receive their payments, and then quietly go about changing their lives. But Susan's thoughts kept returning to her family. If they knew about her windfall, she could already imagine the requests that would follow. Not small loans anymore, but investments in Richard's latest business scheme, or her father's dream vacation home. The thought made her stomach clench. "When you need help, we'll be there," they always said when taking her money. But would they? Had they ever been? Susan couldn't recall a single instance when her financial distress had been met with anything but excuses from those she had helped so readily. An idea began to form in her mind. A test. Simple, perhaps a bit manipulative, but revealing. What if, before telling anyone about her lottery win, she asked for help instead? She had 4 weeks of vacation time saved up at the bank. What if she told her family she'd lost her job and needed a loan to cover expenses until she found new employment? The more Susan thought about it, the more the plan took shape. She would ask for $3,000, the exact amount her father had borrowed last Christmas. She would approach each family member separately, with the same story, the same request, and then she would see who would support her the way she had supported them. It wasn't about the money itself. Susan didn't need their financial help. but she needed to know who would be there for her when the tables were turned. Before she decided who would share in her good fortune, she wanted to see who would share in her fabricated misfortune. The following morning, Susan called her manager and arranged to take her vacation time effective immediately. Her co-workers assumed she was taking time to process their shared windfall and plan her future. Jennifer hugged her tightly before she left the office. $2 million, Susan! Can you believe it? Jennifer whispered, eyes shining with excitement. What are you going to do first? Susan smiled. I'm going to figure out who my real friends and family are. Jennifer looked confused, but Susan offered no further explanation. She cleared her desk, packed her personal items into a cardboard box, maintaining the appearance of someone who had been let go, and headed home to prepare for her test. The next day, Susan sat at her kitchen table and made a list of everyone who had borrowed money from her over the years, along with rough estimates of the amounts. Her father, Harold, approximately $12,000. Her brother, Richard, at least $15,000. Various uncles and cousins, another $8,000 combined. The total made her wince. Nearly $35,000 she would likely never see again. Susan took a deep breath and picked up her phone. Her father would be the first call. She rehearsed her story once more, making sure it sounded believable. She wasn't just testing their willingness to help. She was testing whether they even believed she was capable of losing her job. After all, Susan had been the responsible one, the steady one, for her entire life. Dad? It's Susan. I need to talk to you about something important, she began, her voice deliberately unsteady. Can I come over this afternoon? 3 hours later, Susan stood on her father's doorstep, her heart racing. This was it, the beginning of her experiment. She smoothed down her blouse, deliberately choosing one that looked slightly worn rather than her usual crisp work attire. It was time to see if those who had so easily taken from her would give when she was the one in need. What Susan couldn't have known then was how profoundly this test would change her understanding of her family and herself. As she raised her hand to knock on her father's door, she had no idea that she was about to embark on a journey that would reveal not just who truly cared for her, but what it really meant to have wealth in the ways that mattered most. Harold Davidson's house looked the same as always, a modest, two-story colonial in a middle-class neighborhood, with peeling paint on the shutters and an overgrown lawn that suggested neglect rather than character. Susan had offered to pay for repairs multiple times, but her father always had excuses about waiting for the right contractor or the right season. Now she wondered if those home improvement funds had gone toward his fishing boat instead. "Susie!" Harold exclaimed as he opened the door, his silver hair disheveled and his plaid shirt wrinkled. At 65, he had the energetic demeanor of someone who had never worried about finances, despite the constant state of near crisis he seemed to maintain. "What a surprise! Come in, come in." Susan stepped inside, the familiar scent of her father's aftershave and microwave dinners filling her nostrils. Family photos lined the entryway: Susan's college graduation, Richard's wedding, and subsequent divorce, old holiday gatherings. In most of them, Susan stood slightly apart, the responsible one holding the camera steady, while others enjoyed the moment. "Can I get you something to drink?" Harold asked, leading her into the kitchen. "I've got some of that fancy tea you like." "No, thanks, Dad." Susan settled at the kitchen table, noting the new fishing magazines stacked beside a catalog for boat accessories. The emergency dental work apparently hadn't been too debilitating. "I need to talk to you about something serious." Harold's expression shifted, concern flickering across his features as he sat across from her. "What's wrong, honey? You look tired." Susan took a deep breath, her rehearsed speech suddenly feeling hollow in her throat. This was her father, after all, the man who had taught her to ride a bike, who had cried at her high school graduation. But he was also the man who had taken her hard-earned money without hesitation, time and again. "I lost my job, Dad." The words came out in a rush, her voice cracking convincingly. "The bank is downsizing, and my entire department was cut. I've got some savings, but not enough to cover everything while I look for something new." Harold's eyes widened, genuine shock crossing his face. "But you've been there for what? 10 years? How could they let you go?" 11 years, Susan corrected, the minor detail adding authenticity to her story. "Corporate decision. Nothing personal," they said, "but that doesn't help my mortgage payment." She watched her father process this information, studying his reaction. Would he immediately offer help, the way she always had when he called with financial emergencies? Harold frowned, drumming his fingers on the table. "The job market's tough these days. Not like when I was starting out. Companies have no loyalty anymore." He shook his head. "Have you updated your resume? Maybe Richard knows someone in that tech company he's always talking about." Susan nodded, waiting for more. When it didn't come, she pressed forward. "I've started applying, but it might take a while to find something at my level. I'm worried about making ends meet in the meantime." "You've always been good with money," Harold said, his tone shifting to something Susan recognized as deflection. "I'm sure you've got an emergency fund set aside. You were always lecturing Richard and me about that." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on Susan. Her emergency fund had been depleted multiple times by the very man sitting across from her, claiming her financial prudence while having benefited from its absence. "I did have one," Susan said quietly, "but between helping out family over the years and some unexpected home repairs last fall, it's not enough. I need about $3,000 to cover my mortgage and bills for the next month while I job hunt." The specific amount hung in the air between them, the exact sum Harold had borrowed last Christmas, promising to repay as soon as possible. He hadn't mentioned it since. Harold shifted in his seat, suddenly very interested in the fishing magazine before him. $3,000? That's a lot, Susie." "I know, Dad. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." Susan watched her father's face, looking for any sign of recognition, any acknowledgement of the parallel situation. "Well, it's just—" Harold ran a hand through his thinning hair. "My pension only goes so far, and I've got the property taxes coming up next month, and the boat needs some work before fishing season." "The boat," Susan repeated flatly. "Yeah, there's an issue with the motor. Might be expensive to fix." Harold wasn't meeting her eyes now. "You know, you might want to look into unemployment benefits. That's what they're there for, right?" Susan felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had anticipated this response, had even prepared herself for it, but experiencing it firsthand still stung more than she'd expected. "Right," she said. "Unemployment, benefits, and maybe cut back on some expenses," Harold continued, warming to the subject now that it didn't involve his own wallet. "Do you really need that fancy apartment? Richard lived with me for 6 months after his divorce. Saved a bundle on rent." Susan nodded mechanically, barely listening as her father launched into a lecture about frugality. A lecture that would have been comical if it weren't so painful. This man, who had borrowed thousands from her without hesitation, was now suggesting she move home rather than lend her a fraction of what she had given him over the years. "I should go," Susan said finally, cutting off Harold's monologue about the benefits of coupon clipping. "I've got a job interview to prepare for." The lie came easily now, a small deception within the larger one. "That's the spirit." Harold stood, clearly relieved to end the uncomfortable conversation. "Something will turn up. You're smart, always have been." At the door, he gave her a hug that felt more perfunctory than comforting. "Let me know how the interview goes. And hey, if things get really tight, I've got a pull-out couch in the den." Not once had he mentioned the $3,000 he still owed her. Not once had he acknowledged that she had been his financial safety net for years. Susan drove home in a daze, her experiment yielding exactly the results she had feared but somehow still hoped against. The next day, Susan called her brother. Richard had always been the charismatic one, quick with a joke, and quicker with an excuse for why he needed money. At 42, he worked in sales, though the products seemed to change annually, and lived in a sleek downtown apartment he could barely afford. "Hey, Susie Q!" Richard's voice boomed through the phone. "What's up? I was just thinking about you. There's this investment opportunity that— I need to see you, Susan interrupted. It's important. Can I come over? Richard's apartment was a stark contrast to their father's home. Modern furniture, expensive electronics, and the conspicuous absence of personal photos or mementos. It was a showroom, not a home, designed to impress clients and dates rather than provide comfort. "Wow, you look terrible," Richard said by way of greeting, ushering her inside. "No offense. Bad day at the bank?" "Bad month," Susan replied, settling onto his pristine white couch. "I got laid off." Richard's reaction mirrored their father's initial shock, followed quickly by platitudes about the job market and corporate loyalty. But unlike Harold, Richard immediately saw an angle. "You know, this might be a blessing in disguise," he said, eyes lighting up. "I've been telling you for years that banking is a dead end. Why not come work with me? I'm putting together a team for this new startup. Ground floor opportunity. Could be huge." Susan had heard versions of this pitch before, usually followed by requests for seed money or temporary loans to get things moving. She steered the conversation back to her immediate concern. "I'm worried about making my mortgage payment next month," she said bluntly. "I need about $3,000 to cover expenses while I job hunt." Richard's enthusiasm dimmed visibly. "$3,000? That's specific." "It's what I need for my mortgage and essential bills for 1 month," Susan replied, watching her brother's face as he processed her request. Richard stood and walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city skyline as if contemplating the weight of the world. It was a performance Susan had seen before, what she now recognized as his regretful decline routine. "Thing is, Susie, I'm actually a bit cash-strapped myself right now. All my liquid assets are tied up in the startup. Capital investment phase. You know how it is." He turned, his expression schooled into practiced concern. "But hey, I can put you in touch with some headhunters I know. They're always looking for finance people." Susan nodded, unsurprised but still disappointed. "What about the $5,000 I lent you in March? For your car repairs?" The question was direct, unapologetic. Richard had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. "Yeah, about that. The repairs ended up being more extensive than I thought. I'm still catching up on some other expenses. I was going to talk to you about a payment plan once things stabilized." "Things never seem to stabilize for you, Richard." The words came out softer than Susan intended, more sad than accusatory. Her brother's expression hardened slightly. "Look, we can't all be perfect like you, Susan. Some of us take risks, try to build something. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. That's life. And sometimes those risks are funded by your sister's savings," Susan added quietly. The conversation deteriorated from there, Richard growing defensive, then condescending, suggesting that perhaps Susan had grown too comfortable at the bank and needed to hustle more in her job search. By the time she left, he had promised to keep an ear out for opportunities, but the $3,000 and the $5,000 he already owed remained unmentioned. 2 days and several similar conversations with extended family members later, Susan sat alone in her apartment, a spreadsheet open on her laptop. She had meticulously recorded each interaction, each excuse, each moment of disconnect between what her family claimed about supporting each other and how they actually behaved when she was the one in need. Not a single person had offered financial help. There had been advice, suggestions for cutting expenses, offers to review her resume, but no one had opened their wallet the way she had repeatedly opened hers. The pattern was undeniable, the results of her experiment conclusive. Susan stared at her phone, contemplating her next move. Her test had revealed painful truths about the people she had trusted most, but the experiment wasn't quite complete. There was one family member she hadn't approached yet, her father's sister, Aunt May Davidson. At 68, May lived on the outskirts of town in a small apartment complex for seniors. Susan hadn't initially included her aunt in the experiment because, unlike the others, May had rarely asked for financial help. The one time she had, for blood pressure medication when her insurance temporarily lapsed, she had insisted on repaying Susan as soon as her Social Security check arrived, despite Susan's protests. Susan hadn't visited her aunt in several months, consumed by work and the constant financial demands from other family members. A twinge of guilt pricked at her conscience as she dialed May's number. Unlike the others, this call felt uncomfortable for entirely different reasons. "Susan, dear, what a lovely surprise." May's warm voice came through the phone, instantly triggering a flood of childhood memories. Homemade cookies, bedtime stories during overnight stays, and the constant refrain that Susan was special, smart, and stronger than she knew. "Hi, Aunt May," Susan replied, her rehearsed script suddenly feeling inappropriate. "I was wondering if I could come visit you today." "Of course, sweetheart. I'll put on some tea. The peppermint kind you like." An hour later, Susan parked outside May's apartment building, a weathered brick structure with modest landscaping and a small communal garden where her aunt grew tomatoes and herbs. The contrast between this humble residence and Richard's sleek downtown apartment couldn't have been starker. May opened the door before Susan could knock, enveloping her in a lavender-scented hug. "Come in! Come in! Oh, it's so good to see you." Susan stepped inside and immediately noticed changes since her last visit. The small television she had given May 2 Christmases ago was gone, as was the comfortable armchair that had occupied the corner of the living room. The space felt emptier, and Susan's trained banker's eye recognized the signs of someone quietly downsizing out of necessity. "Sit down, dear. The tea's almost ready." May bustled to the kitchenette, her movements slightly slower than Susan remembered. "How's work at the bank? Still keeping all those numbers in line?" Susan settled onto the worn sofa, noticing a small patch where the fabric had been carefully mended. "Actually, Aunt May, that's partly why I wanted to talk to you." May returned with 2 mismatched teacups, her eyes, the same shade of hazel as Susan's, sharp with concern. "What is it, dear? You look troubled." The practiced story about being laid off felt different here, in this modest apartment that spoke of actual financial constraint, not the manufactured kind that her father and brother perpetually claimed. Susan hesitated, then decided to continue with her experiment, though her heart wasn't fully in it anymore. "I lost my job," she said softly. "The bank downsized my entire department." May's hand flew to her mouth, genuine distress crossing her features. "Oh, Susan! When did this happen?" "Last week." Susan stared into her teacup, the peppermint aroma failing to soothe her growing discomfort. "I've started looking for something new, but it might take some time." Unlike the others, May asked thoughtful questions. When was her last day? Whether she qualified for severance pay, if her health insurance would continue. There was no immediate lecture about job markets or suggestions to move in with relatives. Just concern, attention, and the focused problem-solving of someone who had weathered genuine hardship. "I'm worried about covering my expenses while I job hunt," Susan finally said, the words heavy in her mouth. "My savings won't stretch as far as I thought." May nodded, her expression solemn. "Financial surprises are never easy, especially when you're between jobs." He patted Susan's hand. "How much do you need to get through the next month or so?" Susan couldn't bring herself to name the $3,000 figure she had mentioned to the others. "I'm still working that out," she said vaguely. "Just trying to make a plan." May stood up suddenly, wincing slightly at what Susan suspected was arthritis pain. "Wait right here, dear." Susan watched as her aunt disappeared into the small bedroom, returning moments later with a worn leather checkbook and a small metal cash box. May settled back onto the sofa and began counting out bills. "I have $1,500 in my emergency fund," May said matter-of-factly, arranging the worn bills in a neat stack. "It's yours until you get back on your feet." Susan stared at the money in shock. This was literally everything her aunt had saved. She could see the empty cash box. "Aunt May, I can't take that. That's all your savings." "Of course you can," May insisted, pushing the stack toward Susan. "What's the point of an emergency fund if not for family emergencies? And I have my Social Security coming next week." Susan felt her throat tighten with emotion. "But what about your expenses? Your medications?" May waved away her concern. "I've got enough for those in my checking account." And she opened the checkbook, revealing a balance that made Susan's heart sink further. "I've got $300 in credit on my card. Not much, but you're welcome to that too, if it helps." E2, the difference between this interaction and those with her father and brother was stark. May wasn't offering platitudes or vague promises of help. She was giving Susan literally everything she had saved, without hesitation. "There's something else," May continued, her expression earnest. "I know it's not much, but the spare bedroom is yours if you need it. I can clear out the sewing things. The bed's just a twin, and I don't have a frame for it yet. It's just a mattress on the floor. But we could make it work until you're back on your feet." Susan looked around the tiny apartment, noting the water stain on the ceiling and the draft coming from the poorly sealed windows. May was offering to share what little she had, not out of obligation, but out of love. "When did you sell your TV?" Susan asked suddenly, the question emerging before she could stop it. May looked surprised, then slightly embarrassed. "Oh, you noticed that. It was getting old anyway, dear. And the community room downstairs has a bigger one for when I want to watch my shows." "And the armchair?" May busied herself with her teacup. "Just decluttering. The place looks bigger without it, don't you think?" But Susan had worked at a bank long enough to recognize when someone was hiding financial distress. "Aunt May, are you having money troubles? Please be honest with me." A long silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Another family heirloom that had survived whatever financial cull May had been forced to make. "The building raised the rent in January," May finally admitted, "and my prescription costs went up too. Nothing I can't manage," she added quickly, "but I've had to make some adjustments." Susan's eyes burned with unshed tears. Here was her aunt, selling her possessions to make rent, yet offering Susan her last dollar without hesitation. The stark reality of her experiment hit her full force. The family members who had borrowed thousands from her couldn't spare a dime when she needed help, while the one who had nothing was willing to give everything. "I can't take your money," Susan said firmly, pushing the stack of bills back toward her aunt. "Susan Davidson, don't you dare let pride get in the way," May countered, her tone shifting to the no-nonsense voice of Susan's childhood. "Everyone needs help sometimes." An idea formed in Susan's mind. Perhaps the experiment wasn't just about revealing who would help her, but also about discovering who truly deserved her help once she claimed her lottery winnings. "Actually, Aunt May, there's something I need to tell you." Susan took a deep breath, deciding to end the charade. "I didn't lose my job. I'm on vacation." May looked confused. "But why would you say, 'Because I won the lottery'?" The words felt strange to say aloud, the reality still surreal despite the confirmation letter she carried in her purse. $2 million. May's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "The lottery? But you never play." "Office pool," Susan explained. "We won 10 million split 5 ways. I didn't tell anyone because—" She hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. "Because I wanted to see who would help me if I needed it. After years of lending money to family that never gets repaid, I wanted to know who would be there for me." Understanding dawned on May's face, followed by a flicker of disappointment. "Oh, Susan, testing people like that. I know it wasn't entirely fair," Susan acknowledged, "but I needed to know, before I decided what to do with the money. Who sees me as family, and who sees me as a bank?" May was quiet for a moment, absorbing this revelation. "And what did you learn, dear?" "That the people I've helped the most would help me the least," Susan said softly. "And that you, who I've neglected visiting and haven't supported enough, were ready to give me everything you had." May reached out and took Susan's hand. "Family isn't about keeping score, Susan. It's about caring for each other through good times and bad." "But it should go both ways," Susan insisted. "And with Dad and Richard, It never has. People show love differently, May said gently. Your father and brother may not be good with money, but it's not about the money, Susan interrupted. It's about the fact that they claim to care, but disappear when it's inconvenient. You offered me your last dollar and a place to stay. They wouldn't even consider a loan. The same kind of loan they've asked from me dozens of times. May couldn't argue with that. She sighed, squeezing Susan's hand. So what happens now, with your winnings? Susan looked around the small apartment, noticing for the first time the medications lined up on the kitchen counter, the worn carpet, the single sweater hanging by the door that looked insufficient for the coming winter. First, she said decisively, you're getting a proper apartment. Something with an elevator, better heating, and no rent increases. And health insurance, the good kind, that covers all your medications. May shook her head. Susan, that's your money. You don't need to— I want to, Susan interrupted. You were willing to give me everything you had without a second thought. Let me do this for you. Tears welled in May's eyes. And what about your father and Richard? Will you tell them about the lottery? Susan considered this question. Her initial anger had faded somewhat during their conversation, leaving behind a more nuanced understanding of her family dynamics. Eventually, she said, but not yet. And when I do, things will be different. No more enabling bad habits or financial irresponsibility. That seems fair, May nodded. Though they won't like it. Probably not, Susan agreed. But maybe it will be better for all of us in the long run. As Susan drove home later that evening, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The lottery win had given her financial freedom, but her experiment had given her something equally valuable: clarity about her relationships and the courage to establish healthier boundaries. The next morning, Susan made two important calls. The first was to a real estate agent, tasking them with finding a perfect apartment for May, something accessible, comfortable, and in a good neighborhood. The second was to her financial advisor at the bank, to begin the process of claiming her winnings and establishing a trust for May's ongoing care. She also composed a message to her father and brother, informing them that she had been rehired at the bank and no longer needed financial assistance. Neither responded with anything beyond a perfunctory, "Glad to hear it," confirming what Susan already knew. They had been relieved not to help, rather than disappointed. They couldn't. As Susan prepared for her meeting with the Lottery Commission, she found herself filled with an unexpected sense of peace. Money, she was learning, revealed truths about people, not by its presence, but by how they behaved in its absence. And sometimes, the wealthiest people were those who had the least in their bank accounts, but the most in their hearts. 2 weeks after revealing her lottery win to Aunt May, Susan stood in the doorway of a sunlit 2-bedroom apartment in a well-maintained building with an elevator, security system, and a small community garden. The hardwood floors gleamed. The kitchen featured new appliances, and large windows offered views of the city park across the street. Most importantly, it was in a building with fixed rent for seniors, ensuring May would never again have to sell her possessions to make monthly payments. "What do you think?" Susan asked, watching her aunt's expression carefully. May moved slowly through the space, touching the granite countertops with reverent fingers, opening cabinet doors, and peering into the spacious bathroom with its walk-in shower and safety bars. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But Susan, this must cost a fortune." "It's an investment," Susan replied firmly, "in your comfort and my peace of mind." The truth was, Susan had paid the entire lease for 5 years up front, negotiating a substantial discount in the process. Her financial advisor had initially questioned this allocation of funds, suggesting that May could make do with something less expensive. But Susan had been adamant. If anyone deserved comfort in their golden years, it was the woman who had offered her last dollar to help her niece. "There's something else," Susan said, leading May to the second bedroom. She opened the door to reveal a small but well-equipped art studio, with an easel, paints, and a comfortable chair positioned near the window for optimal light. You always said you wanted to paint when you retired, but never had the space. May's hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Oh, Susan. True. Consider it compensation for all those drawing lessons you gave me when I was little, Susan said, smiling at the memory of spending hours at May's kitchen table, learning to sketch flowers and birds under her patient guidance. The moving company arrived an hour later, bringing May's few possessions along with several carefully selected new furniture pieces Susan had ordered. The television and armchair May had been forced to sell had been replaced with higher-quality versions, and the delivery included a new mattress and bed frame, comfortable linens, and a small writing desk where May could pay bills and write letters. As the movers arranged everything according to May's directions, Susan slipped into the kitchen and discreetly stocked the refrigerator and pantry with groceries. She had learned that May had been skipping meals to save money, and the thought of her aunt going hungry while Susan's father and brother lived comfortably made her blood boil. "This still feels like a dream," May said later as they sat on her new sofa, drinking tea from her old mismatched cups. The one thing May had insisted on keeping. "I keep expecting to wake up. It's very real," Susan assured her. "And there's more." May shook her head. "Susan, the apartment is already too much." "It's not too much," Susan countered gently. "And this isn't just about money. It's about making sure you're taken care of the way you've always taken care of others." Susan reached into her bag and pulled out a folder containing documents for a comprehensive health insurance policy, a prepaid prescription plan, and details of the modest but comfortable monthly allowance she had arranged for May through a trust. "I don't want you to ever worry about choosing between medication and food again," Susan explained, placing the folder on the coffee table. "Everything's been set up through my financial advisor. It's completely separate from my personal accounts, so even if I went broke tomorrow, your support would continue." May stared at the folder, then at Susan, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude and concern. "This is incredibly generous. But what about your future? $2 million is a lot of money, but it won't last forever if you're spending it on me." Susan smiled. "I've been very careful with the arrangements. This," she gestured to encompass the apartment and the folder, "represents less than 15% of my winnings. The rest is being prudently invested for my future." What Susan didn't mention was that she had also established a separate emergency fund for May's unexpected expenses, and a medical contingency account in case May's health deteriorated and she needed additional care. These funds were substantial but necessary for Susan's peace of mind. "Have you told your father or Richard about the lottery yet?" May asked, changing the subject. Susan sighed, setting down her teacup. "No, and I'm not sure when I will." In the weeks since her experiment, Susan had maintained minimal contact with her father and brother. When they called, always with some new financial crisis brewing, she politely but firmly declined to help, citing her own recovery from job insecurity. The pattern was revealing. Once it became clear she wouldn't provide money, their communication dwindled to perfunctory holiday wishes and occasional family updates. "They'll find out eventually," May pointed out. "Money like that doesn't stay secret forever, especially in families." "I know," Susan acknowledged, "but I'm still figuring out how to handle it. If I tell them now, they'll see me as their personal ATM again. If I never tell them, I'm being deceitful." She paused, conflicted. "What would you do, Aunt May?" May considered the question carefully, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "I believe in honesty," she said finally, "but I also believe in boundaries. Perhaps the question isn't whether to tell them, but what conditions to set when you do." Susan nodded slowly, May's wisdom resonating with her own thoughts. "Conditions like no more loans? Like helping them in ways that actually improve their lives, not just enable bad habits," May clarified. "Your father isn't getting any younger. A proper retirement plan might serve him better than cash he'll spend on fishing equipment." The suggestion planted a seed in Susan's mind. Perhaps there was a middle path, one that allowed her to be generous without being exploited. that acknowledged family ties without sacrificing her own financial security. The following Saturday, Susan met Jennifer Sanders for lunch at their favorite cafe. Unlike Susan's family, Jennifer had no idea about the experiment, believing Susan had simply taken vacation time to process their shared good fortune. "So," Jennifer asked eagerly after they ordered, "have you done anything wild with your winnings yet? Round-the-world cruise? Sports car? Designer shopping spree?" Susan laughed, shaking her head. "Nothing that exciting. I've been helping my aunt get settled in a new apartment and setting up some investments." Jennifer's expression softened. "That's so you, Susan. Always taking care of others first." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "But surely there's something you want just for yourself? Something completely frivolous and joy-inducing?" The question gave Susan pause. In all her planning and managing of her newfound wealth, she hadn't considered what might bring her personal happiness beyond the security the money provided. "I haven't really thought about it," she admitted. "I've been so focused on doing the responsible thing." "Exactly my point," Jennifer exclaimed. "You've spent your whole life being responsible. Maybe it's time to balance that with a little adventure." After lunch, Susan found herself wandering through the downtown shopping district, Jennifer's words echoing in her mind. What did she want for herself? The question was surprisingly difficult to answer after years of putting her own desires last. She passed a travel agency, with posters of exotic destinations in the window. Crystal clear waters in Bali, ancient ruins in Peru, lavender fields in Provence. Susan had always dreamed of traveling but had deferred those plans repeatedly to help family members with their financial emergencies. On impulse, she stepped inside and emerged an hour later with brochures for a 2-week European tour. London, Paris, Rome, and Barcelona. It wasn't quite spontaneous. The trip was scheduled for 3 months later, giving her plenty of time to prepare. But it was a step toward prioritizing her own joy. The real test came the following week, when Susan received a call from her father. His tone was casual, almost jovial, as if their last interaction, where he had refused to help her in her fabricated time of need, had never happened. "Susie, good news. I found a buyer for the boat. Guy's offering $7,000 cash deal." Susan waited, knowing what was coming next. "Thing is," Harold continued predictably, "he won't be able to pay until next month, and I've got my eye on a cabin property upstate. Nothing fancy, just a little fishing spot. There's another interested buyer, so I need to move fast with a deposit. Any chance you could float me $5,000? Just until the boat sale comes through, of course." In the past, Susan would have agreed immediately, desperate for her father's approval and convinced that this time he would actually repay her. Now, with clarity born from her experiment and May's advice, she saw the situation differently. "I can't do that, Dad," she said calmly. Harold's surprise was audible. "What do you mean? You can't? I thought things were back to normal with your job situation." "They are," Susan confirmed. "But that doesn't mean I can lend you $5,000 for a cabin you don't need, when you already have a boat you're selling because you can't afford its maintenance." "Now wait a minute," Harold began, his tone shifting from surprise to indignation. "Dad," Susan interrupted gently but firmly, "I love you, but this pattern needs to stop. I'm not a bank. I'm your daughter." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken history. Years of financial imbalance, of Susan giving and her father taking, of promises made and broken. "So that's how it is," Harold finally said, his voice cold. "The one time I've needed your help in years, and you turn your back." Susan almost laughed at the absurdity of his statement, but maintained her composure. "That's not accurate, and you know it. I've helped you dozens of times. Thousands of dollars worth of help that was never repaid." "I'm your father," Harold exclaimed, as if that fact alone entitled him to unlimited financial support. "Yes, you are," Susan agreed, "and I love you. But loving you doesn't mean funding every impulse purchase you make." The conversation ended with Harold hanging up abruptly, leaving Susan both sad and strangely liberated. Setting boundaries was painful but necessary, she realized, and perhaps it was better to have this confrontation now, before her family knew about her lottery winnings. That evening, as Susan prepared dinner in her apartment, she received a text message from May. "The light in my studio is perfect for painting at sunset. Thank you for making an old woman's dream come true. Love you." Attached was a photo of May's first painting, a watercolor of the park view from her new apartment, the colors vibrant and full of life. Susan saved the image and set it as her phone's background, a reminder that generosity should flow toward those who appreciate it, rather than those who expect it. As Susan ate her dinner, she realized she was at a crossroads. Her experiment had revealed painful truths about her family relationships, but knowledge alone wasn't enough. The real question was what to do with that knowledge, how to reshape her connections with her father and brother while preserving her own financial and emotional well-being. The answer, she decided, would require as much care and planning as managing her lottery winnings. And like those winnings, the true value would be determined not by the amount, but by how wisely it was invested. 3 months after her lottery win, Susan stood on the balcony of her Paris hotel room, watching the Eiffel Tower sparkle against the night sky. The cool autumn air carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery below, and distant accordion music floated up from a street performer several blocks away. It was her 10th day of the European tour, and Susan had finally mastered the art of being present, of savoring each experience without worrying about work emails or family demands. Her phone buzzed with a text from Aunt May. "Just sold my first painting at the Senior Center Art Show. $75. I'm treating myself to dinner out. How's Paris? Send pictures of everything." Susan smiled, snapping a photo of her view and sending it with the caption, "Congratulations on becoming a professional artist. Paris sends its admiration." She had called May every third day of her trip, delighting in her aunt's vicarious enjoyment of European adventures. Unlike conversations with her father and brother, these calls left Susan feeling energized rather than drained. The past 3 months had brought significant changes to Susan's life. After considerable thought and several consultations with both her financial advisor and a family therapist, she had developed what she privately called her family financial plan, a structured approach to managing both her relationships and her newfound wealth. The first phase had been setting up her own life. Susan had purchased a comfortable 3-bedroom condominium in a peaceful neighborhood, with a home office and a guest room for when May visited. The purchase was modest compared to what she could afford, but it represented security and independence, values Susan now prioritized above extravagance. She had also resigned from her position at the bank, not because she needed to financially, but because 20 years of helping others manage their money had left her eager to pursue other interests. Jennifer had been shocked, but supportive, extracting a promise that they would remain friends regardless of their employment status. "What will you do instead?" Jennifer had asked over farewell drinks with their colleagues. "Live deliberately," Susan had replied, quoting Thoreau. "I've spent my entire adult life being cautious and responsible. Now I want to explore." The second phase of her plan had been the most challenging, confronting her family about her lottery win and establishing new boundaries around money. Susan had arranged a dinner at a neutral location, a private room in a modest restaurant, and invited her father, brother, and Aunt May. "I have something important to tell all of you," she had begun once they were seated. 3 months ago, I won the lottery as part of an office pool at the bank. My share was $2 million. The reactions had been exactly as Susan anticipated. Her father and Richard exchanged quick, calculating glances before their expressions shifted to exaggerated joy. May, who already knew, simply squeezed Susan's hand supportively. "That's incredible!" Richard exclaimed, his mind visibly racing with possibilities. "No wonder you've been so mysterious lately. We should celebrate. I know this great champagne bar downtown." "There's more," Susan interrupted gently, but firmly. "This dinner isn't just about sharing my news. It's about clarifying how things will work going forward. She explained that she had established a family trust with a portion of her winnings. The trust had specific parameters. It would cover genuine emergencies like medical bills or essential home repairs, educational expenses for anyone wanting to improve their skills, and seed money for legitimate business opportunities, but only with proper business plans vetted by Susan's financial advisor. "What about loans?" Richard had asked immediately. "Like if someone needed capital for a short-term investment opportunity?" "The trust doesn't provide personal loans," Susan had explained calmly, "but it can invest in viable businesses with proper oversight." Harold had frowned. "Seems complicated. Why not just help family directly when they need it? That's what family does." "Because I've learned that sometimes helping means more than just giving money," Susan had replied. "Sometimes it means encouraging independence and responsibility." The conversation had grown tense, with both her father and brother arguing that Susan was being needlessly bureaucratic, even suggesting that her sudden wealth had changed her for the worse. Throughout their accusations, Susan remained composed, neither apologizing for her boundaries nor withdrawing her offer of structured support. "I understand you're disappointed," she had said finally. "You were hoping for unconditional access to my winnings, but that's not what I'm offering. I'm offering a way for us to have healthier financial interactions going forward." May had spoken up then, her quiet voice commanding unexpected attention. "Susan is being extraordinarily generous. Many lottery winners don't share a penny with family." Instead of complaining about the terms, perhaps gratitude would be more appropriate. The dinner had ended with uncertainty hanging in the air. Harold and Richard had departed with forced smiles and brittle congratulations, while May had stayed behind to tell Susan how proud she was of her strength. In the weeks that followed, Susan had waited for the dust to settle. Richard was the first to reach out, calling with a surprisingly thorough business plan for a mobile application he wanted to develop. The idea was actually promising, a tool to help people track and reduce their carbon footprint, and with proper oversight from the trust, Susan approved the initial funding. Harold had taken longer to come around. His first attempt had been another thinly veiled request for a loan to buy the cabin property, which Susan had gently redirected to the trust's parameters. When that failed, he had fallen silent for nearly a month before calling with a different approach. "I've been thinking about what you said," he had admitted grudgingly, "about responsibility and independence, and maybe—" he had paused, the words clearly difficult for him. "Maybe I haven't been as careful with money as I should have been." It wasn't quite an apology for years of financial exploitation, but it was a start. Susan had suggested he work with the financial planner provided by the trust to develop a proper retirement strategy, and to her surprise, Harold had agreed. Now, as Susan gazed at the Parisian skyline, her phone buzzed again. A message from Richard. "App launch exceeded expectations. 3,000 downloads in first week. The trust's investment was crucial. Thank you for believing in this project." Attached was a screenshot of his application's download statistics and a link to a tech blog that had featured it favorably. Susan felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps her brother had needed structure and accountability more than he had needed easy cash. Her European journey continued for 4 more days, concluding in Barcelona with its stunning architecture and vibrant street life. As Susan packed for her return flight, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. The lottery win had transformed her financial reality, but her own experiment had transformed something far more valuable: her understanding of relationships and self-worth. Upon returning home, Susan found an invitation waiting in her mail, a gallery showing featuring local senior artists, including May Davidson. The event was scheduled for the following weekend at a respected community art space. Susan marked her calendar immediately, touched that her aunt had pursued her artistic passion with such dedication. The gallery was crowded when Susan arrived, locals mingling with family members of the artists, all enjoying wine and finger foods as they admired the displayed work. She found May standing proudly beside 3 watercolor paintings, each depicting scenes from her new neighborhood, the park in different seasons, rendered with surprising skill and emotional depth. "These are beautiful," Susan said sincerely, embracing her aunt. "You've been hiding your talent all these years." May blushed with pleasure. "The instructor says I have a good eye for light. And look," he pointed to a small red dot sticker on the frame of one painting, "that one sold already, to a real collector." As they chatted, Susan noticed a familiar figure across the room, examining May's paintings with apparent interest. It was her father, dressed more formally than usual in a pressed shirt and blazer. "Did you invite him?" Susan whispered to May. "No," May replied, surprised. "I mentioned the show when we spoke last week, but I didn't expect him to come." Harold approached them tentatively, as if unsure of his welcome. "These are really something, May," he said, gesturing to the paintings. "I had no idea you were so talented." "Thank you, Harold," May replied warmly. "It's amazing what one can discover about oneself when given the opportunity." The pointed comment wasn't lost on Susan, but Harold seemed genuinely interested, rather than defensive. "The financial advisor Susan connected me with has been helpful," he said, directing his words to Susan. "We've restructured my retirement plan. I might actually be able to retire at 70 instead of working until I drop." "I'm glad to hear that," Susan replied, cautiously optimistic about this new, more responsible version of her father. "And I sold the boat," Harold added. "Put the money toward paying off my mortgage instead of buying that cabin." The advisor said it was a smarter move long-term. Susan blinked in surprise. The Harold Davidson she had known all her life would never have prioritized mortgage payments over a recreational property. Perhaps the structured support of the trust was having its intended effect after all. As the gallery event continued, Susan observed her small family with new eyes. May, flourishing in her creative renaissance. Harold, taking halting steps toward financial responsibility. And herself, no longer the family bank, but a thoughtful steward of resources, both financial and emotional. Later that evening, Susan hosted May and Harold for dinner at her new condominium. The conversation flowed more easily than she had expected, touching on May's art, Harold's retirement planning, and Susan's European adventures. Richard had sent his regrets, busy with his app launch events, but had promised to visit the following weekend. "I've been thinking about doing some volunteer work," Susan mentioned, as they enjoyed dessert on her balcony. "Maybe financial literacy coaching for women in transitional housing, using my banking background for something meaningful." "That sounds perfect for you," May said encouragingly. "You've always had a gift for explaining complex financial concepts in simple terms." Harold nodded, adding unexpectedly, "You could probably teach a class at the senior center too. A lot of folks there getting scammed because they don't understand modern banking." The suggestion touched Susan deeply, not just because it was thoughtful, but because it indicated that her father was finally seeing her as a person with valuable skills, not just a source of funds. After her guests departed, Susan stood alone on her balcony, watching the city lights and reflecting on the journey of the past several months. The lottery win had been life-changing, but not in the ways she had initially imagined. The true transformation hadn't come from the money itself, but from the clarity it had provided about her relationships, her boundaries, and her own worth. The simple experiment she had devised, asking for help rather than giving it, had revealed painful truths, but also unexpected possibilities. It had shown her who truly cared and who merely took advantage. Most importantly, it had empowered her to reshape her family dynamics on healthier terms. Susan thought about the version of herself from 6 months ago, the reliable banker who couldn't say no to family, who measured her worth by how much she provided for others. That Susan seemed like a distant relative now, someone she remembered with compassion, but no desire to return to. Her phone chimed with an email notification, the family trust administrator confirming that Richard's app development milestone had been reached and the next phase of funding approved. The structured oversight was working, encouraging her brother's genuine talents while discouraging the impulsive financial decisions of his past. Another text arrived from May. "Thank you for tonight, and for everything. You've given me more than a new home and financial security. You've given me the chance to discover who I am at 68. What a gift that is." Susan smiled, typing back, "You gave me something more valuable. You showed me what unconditional love really looks like, even when you thought I had nothing." As she prepared for bed, Susan found herself filled with a profound sense of peace. The lottery win hadn't simply made her rich in financial terms. It had enriched her understanding of wealth in all its forms. Material security, yes, but also authentic relationships, personal boundaries, and the freedom to live according to one's true values. In testing her family's response to her fabricated need, Susan had discovered an essential truth. People reveal their character not when times are easy, but when offering help becomes inconvenient. May, with virtually nothing to her name, had offered everything. That generosity of spirit was the true wealth Susan now aspired to cultivate, both in herself and in her gradually healing family relationships. The money would provide comfort and opportunities for years to come. But Susan now understood that the lottery's greatest prize had been this hard-won wisdom. True wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the authentic connections we forge, the boundaries we maintain, and the values we live by every day. As she drifted off to sleep, Susan felt grateful not just for the random sequence of numbers that had changed her financial future, but for the courage to test, learn, and grow, to transform an unexpected windfall into something far more valuable than money alone could ever be. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment below. What city are you watching from? And if your heart tells you to, feel free to leave me a tip on Buy Me a Coffee. Just check the first pinned comment. Thanks for keeping me company and for the coffee, and I'll see you in the next story.